And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How we living? Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast, your premier podcast for all things Oregon football and recruiting. Just in case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks over on Fan Nation, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. It is Thursday, August 10th, 2023. Fall camp is well underway in Eugene. Football is in the air, so we have plenty to get into today in today's episode of the pod. Going to be talking about Oregon football's checklist in fall camp. What items do Dan Lanning and the Ducks need to check off their list between now and ultimately that season opener on September 2nd against the Portland State Vikings in Eugene at Autzen Stadium? Going to be doing a two-part episode. Going to start off talking about the offense and then wrap up on the back half talking about the defense. So should be a very fun episode. We are coming to you live in 3 different locations for today's show. We're live on YouTube, of course, at Oregon Football Max Torres, as well as on Twitter at mtorresports, and on Facebook. Added Facebook to the stream, the Ducks Digest Facebook. We're just at Ducks Digest there as well. So plenty of places for you guys to tune into the show. Excited to have you guys along. If you are here in the live stream, go ahead and hop in the live chat. Leave me a comment. Let me know what's on your mind. Maybe ask me a question about Oregon football or recruiting, and I'll do my best to incorporate those into today's show. So that being said, let's start things off, maybe looking at a couple of big picture items. The first one, I think, is pretty obvious, but you want to get the freshmen up to speed. Fortunately for Oregon, they had a majority of their 2023 recruiting class enroll early, either in December or January. A lot of guys come to campus after the All-American Bowls. And then you also have guys that came in the spring. But Oregon finds themselves in a situation where they had a number of guys from this 2023 class that did not enroll early and enrolled not late, but at the start of summer, more or less. Guys like Blake Purchase, the edge rusher out of Colorado, Ashton Porter, the edge rusher from Texas, Jurion Dickey, All-American 5-star wide receiver that signed with Oregon, cornerbacks Dalen Austin and Roderick Pleasant, and Colin Gill. And then Lipe Moala, I believe, the offensive lineman from Modern Day, is another guy that did not enroll early. So kind of what they're going to have to do is get those guys up to speed, whether it be in the weight room, in the playbook, on the field, just getting used to the feel of the game. But I think that's kind of a big picture thing that Oregon has to get taken care of here in fall camp, because you could very well find out that, some of those guys might be called on sooner rather than later, with the 2023 season very quickly approaching. So I think one thing that comes to mind as far as an offensive checklist item for Dan Lanning and the Ducks really goes to Will Stein. Let Will Stein leave his mark on this offense. Answer the question, what does the Oregon offense's identity look like following the departure of Kenny Dillingham? We all know the story with Kenny Dillingham. He came to Oregon and absolutely lit things up as the offensive coordinator for Oregon. They were putting up points left and right. Bo Nix looked like a completely different player. The offensive line was amazing. There was a lot of physicality in their game. They were still able to pound the rock more or less at will. And they were spreading the ball around. So what tenets of that offense are we going to continue to see with Will Stein? What does the tempo look like? What does the pace look like? How are they getting the ball to their top playmakers in space? How often are you throwing to running backs out of the backfield? How often do you have Bo Nix running the ball as one of the top dual threat quarterbacks in all of college football? Those are questions that I think you can really start answering a little bit as we go throughout fall camp. The Ducks typically tend to hold scrimmages on the weekend, so we'll see how much they're able to do that and kind of what some of the chatter is out of there. And then also just getting on the same page as far as terminology and signals go. I think fortunately for Oregon, like I talked about in the last episode of the podcast, they do have a lot of carryover on this offensive staff, whether it's Junior Adams with the wide receivers, Carlos Lachlan with the running backs. That's a good spot to ultimately find yourself in. But you do have a couple of new guys, obviously Will Stein working with the quarterbacks, Alik Terry working with the offensive line. Those are some newer guys that obviously have to find what works best for them and maybe tweak some things from last year, because those are not going to be the same systems, obviously. And then that kind of bleeds into one of my more specific checklist items for the Oregon offense here in fall camp. They need to figure out what their new starting offensive line is going to look like. We got to hear from Ajani Cornelius following Wednesday's practice in Eugene out of fall camp, and he's talking about how the connection and the chemistry are starting to get there. Fortunately for Oregon, Ajani Cornelius was able to enroll in time for spring ball. And he's, I think, the most touted transfer offensive lineman that the Ducks got following the end of the 2022 season, coming over from Rhode Island. And fortunately for Oregon, the offensive line picture is looking steady, but not solidified. I think that you have a handful of guys that you maybe know are going to start. You have a good idea of where they kind of slot into that offensive line. I think Jackson Powers Johnson is one of those guys. He looks like he could be one of the perhaps the leading candidate right now to take over at center for Oregon, following in the footsteps of Alex Forsyth. Jackson Powers Johnson landed on the Remington Award watch list for the best center in college football. So I think that Jackson Powers Johnson is probably the guy that, as of right now, looks like he's going to be starting at center for Oregon. But you also have Marcus Harper, and he got a little bit banged up in spring ball. So I wonder how much that time that he missed from the game kind of maybe helped Jackson Powers Johnson solidify himself as the guy at center for Oregon. But Marcus Harper is also a very quality option for the Ducks at center. So I think we'll end up seeing one of those two guys play center for the Ducks this year. I also think that Josh Connerly Jr. is one of those guys that you can probably pretty confidently say is going to be the starting left tackle for Oregon. He played a whole lot of ball, a lot of snaps in 2022, and a lot of people, I think, within the program and certainly in the fan base are looking at Josh Connerly as the next Penei Sewell, the next marquee elite offensive lineman to come through Eugene. And Alik Terry's talked about how Josh Connerly is one of the hardest workers in that offensive line room, about how his footwork. This is a guy who played a lot of basketball at Rainier Beach in the Seattle area in high school. So he is a supreme athlete, and we're starting to get to hear more from him during fall camp here in his sophomore year. So I think Josh Connerly is a guy that you're definitely going to see a lot of. Ajani Cornelius from Rhode Island, one of the most highly sought after, perhaps the top offensive lineman, offensive tackle in the transfer portal this cycle. He looks like he could probably be in a good spot to, I think, take that right tackle spot for Oregon, the spot that was held down by Male Sala Amavela-Ulu last year. And I think you could see him playing there. But you also have Stephen Jones, who has some experience at right tackle. He played a lot of guard last year for Oregon. So you're trying to find the perfect combo or the right balance of a lot of these returning pieces from the 2022 season. And then how do those guys mesh, not only with the true freshmen from the 2023 recruiting class, but also these other guys that you got out of the portal. I'm talking about Junior Angalau from Texas. I'm talking about Nishad Strother from East Carolina. He's another guy that projects to be on the interior. I think that Cornelius, he started almost all of his games last year for Rhode Island at tackle, so I think you're going to see him at the right tackle spot. But Angalau, Strother, and Stephen Jones are kind of those guys that I think you're going to be moving around a little bit along that offensive line to see what the best combo you really have is. And then Faope Laulaulu, he's a guy who's been around Oregon for a while now, and I wonder where he's going to ultimately find his spot. Maybe not so much as a starter, but someone in that two deep. A lot of the times you'll find coaches like to have 6, 7, 8 offensive linemen are ready to go at any time, or starter quality type of deal. And this is where Oregon's going to be able to, I think, see some of last year's snaps really come into focus. And then you're going to be able to have guys who have played a lot of football for you. Maybe if it's not in a starting capacity, they've been out there a lot, like Josh Connerly, and then like Stephen Jones, who played quite a bit last year. Another guy to maybe keep an eye on is George Silva, the junior college offensive line transfer that the Ducks were able to sign in the 2023 class from Fullerton College. He's another guy that they're really excited about. Super, super athletic, and a lot of potential. But he's not super experienced when it just comes to playing football. This past junior college season was his first full season playing football. So I think he's maybe a little bit more of a project, but he looks like someone who is already making his mark on the Oregon offensive line. So the Ducks need to figure out that new starting offensive line, and obviously that's super important because of who they're protecting. Bo Nix, he's the face of this Oregon team. He's the face of this Oregon offense, and this offense will ultimately go not only as far as Bo Nix can take them, but as far as the offensive line can take them. You got to be able to establish the run. We know that that's been a mark of the Oregon offense for a long time, but you also have to be able to pass. So that's kind of my little 2 cents on the offensive line. I think you need to find that starting offensive line combination for the Ducks here in 2023. And Alik Terry definitely has something to prove now that he's back with the Ducks, and he'll be working alongside Mike Cavanaugh, Cutter Leftwich in that offensive line room. So there definitely remains quite a bit to be seen of what Oregon's offensive line will ultimately look like come 2023 under Alik Terry, but I think there is plenty of reason to be optimistic that they're going to be one of the best units in the Pac-12 for sure on the West Coast, and maybe even nationally. I think that the bar has been set incredibly high given last year's performance with guys like Ryan Walk, Alex Forsyth, Sala, who we mentioned. So there's a lot of guys that I think this year's offensive linemen are going to be trying to, play up to that level. I think it's only natural that you take some kind of a step back after surrendering. I believe it was only 5 total sacks last year. But you lose some personnel. You lose Adrian Clem, who goes back to the NFL ranks. But you know for a fact that Alik Terry is listening to that, and he's just hearing excuses. So he's going to try to have his guys as ready as possible. I love his energy. I love listening to his interviews. Super smart football mind. He's a guy that has obviously been hitting it off with the players from a relationship standpoint. And I think that he's certainly someone that those guys definitely want to play for. So I'm excited about this Oregon offensive line, but as of right now, it's a little bit of a question mark with 1 week in the books with fall camp. Now we need to talk about the quarterback position, and there's nothing that Bo Nix needs to do. I think it's looking behind Nix, where Oregon still has a little bit of work to do. You got to figure out who your solid QB2 is. Some people might think this is already, kind of wrapped up, signed, sealed, and delivered. Ty Thompson as quarterback 2, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him ultimately be a QB2 for the Ducks, as serving as Nix's primary backup. But really the point I'm getting at is that you need to make sure that either Ty Thompson or Austin Novosad is ready to go in there and win you games. I think that's what Lanning said as far as what he wants to see from the backup quarterback at Oregon, someone that can be called upon and still be able to win games for Oregon. Let's be perfectly clear. This is not something that the Ducks have had in recent years. I'm trying to think back to the last time they did have a really capable backup. Maybe you're looking at the Anthony Brown, Tyler Shuck era when those guys were splitting snaps a little bit. But I've kind of made it known my thoughts on Ty Thompson. Great kid, super promising, lots of potential, but he just hasn't shown it during his time at Oregon to really be the guy. You see that the sample kind of looks the same each time we see Ty Thompson take the field as far as, processing speed goes, looking composed and ultimately making good decisions and taking care of the ball. I don't believe that's necessarily something that we've seen from Ty Thompson, which is why I think it's also important to keep an eye on the development of Austin Novosad, who Dan Lanning said has been doing well and making strides so far in fall camp. Pretty generic coach talk from a language standpoint, but this is where it could come into play the benefits of enrolling early for Austin Novosad, who was an Adidas All-American, played in the state of Texas, has put on a decent amount of weight. I think that was one of my little critiques when I saw him at the All-American Bowl in San Antonio, was that he just was very slight of frame. But you could definitely see why Will Stein likes that guy. So the quarterback picture, it's figured out, but it's also something that's definitely worth monitoring from a backup standpoint, because you saw what happened in that Washington game. Ty Thompson came in after Bo Nix got hurt, and I want to be clear, I'm not placing that loss on Ty Thompson at all. That's completely unfair. But Ty Thompson came in that game when Bo Nix got hurt, and the Ducks couldn't move the ball, and they didn't really give him a chance to pass the ball. I think it was 3 straight run plays, and that was obviously all she wrote once the Ducks couldn't score on that drive, or I think they settled for a field goal it was. But at the end of the day, you have to have 2 quarterbacks that you are ready to go into battle with and ready to trot out there on the field at any given time. And Bo Nix is their guy for now, but you got to make sure that you have that backup spot secured and ready to go. So I think that Ty Thompson also enters a very important stretch of fall camp here with the Ducks, working under Will Stein. It's his 3rd offensive coordinator that he's had since he's been at Oregon. Started with Joe Moorhead under Mario Cristobal. Then you have Kenny Dillingham last year under Dan Lanning. And now you have Will Stein, who comes in from UTSA following Dillingham's departure to Arizona State. So the quarterback picture is looking real solid for Oregon. So you got to figure out who's behind Nix. And then looking even further down the road, if you're looking at the recruiting situation, you got to figure out who's next down the line in the 2024 class, seeing that the Ducks are going to have to prepare for life after Bo Nix. Fortunately for the Ducks, I really don't think we have to talk very much about the running back picture. Carlos Lachlan has one of the best backfields in the country with Noah Whittington and Bucky Irving, who are both named to the Doak Walker Award watch list. They're awarded annually to the nation's best running back. Oregon is just the rich get richer when it comes to the running back spot. And you have Jordan James as a guy who enters the 2023 season with a decent amount of hype. You know, he burned his red shirt in 2022, played a decent amount of snaps. And I think that he's a guy who is in line to maybe even carve out a bigger role this year, seeing that he served as the team's number 3 back, with Bucky and Noah serving as kind of 1A and 1B. But that being said, it's going to be exciting to see how these running back snaps are divvied up and how much of Dante Dowdell and Jaden Lamar, the 2 true freshman running backs that the Ducks have in 23, how much of those guys really see the field? How does the coaching staff manage those 4 games that they have of wiggle room within the redshirt rule? So the running back spot, not a concern, really not a lot of questions. It's just a matter of how much of Jordan James are we going to see, and can Dante Dowdell and Jaden Lamar maybe carve out some roles? The Ducks definitely want to use some of those non-conference games. I'm looking at Portland State and Hawaii to run up the score and get those guys some snaps, because those are their best opportunities early on in that non-conference schedule. Let's see what else we have here. What else do we have? Let's talk about the tight end spot. What do we know about the tight end position for Oregon and Drew Maringer? Well, Terrence Ferguson is back to 100%. He's at full health after getting banged up in spring football and being forced to miss a little bit of time. But really the question is, who do the Ducks have after Terrence Ferguson? We know that they have Patrick Herbert, who's a pretty experienced tight end at this point. And Patrick Herbert enters the 23 season with some momentum, seeing that he played all of 2022. He's a guy who has battled a whole lot of injuries during his time as a Duck. He had a touchdown catch and run in that Cal game last year, which was definitely the highlight of his season, kind of using him maybe more as an inline blocker. But I want to look and see how the offense looks to get Patrick Herbert involved, because I think he is capable of making a big impact. There's no doubt in my mind that Terrence Ferguson is the premier passing threat from this tight end room. You know, he was number 2 on the team last year in touchdowns, and he definitely became one of Bo Nix's favorite targets. But what does the rest of that tight end room look like? I think Patrick Herbert enters the 23 season with a chip on his shoulder, looking to have his best season yet. If I'm Patrick Herbert, I'm looking in the locker room saying, hey, I've been here for a while, but this is my opportunity to really carry that momentum from last year into this year and make a name for myself. You know, I want to be known as Patrick Herbert, the standout tight end at Oregon, not just Justin Herbert's brother. And I got to give some credit to Patrick Herbert, because when Justin Herbert got drafted and you know, he's killing it in the NFL, that's a lot of the questions that he ends up fielding in these media availabilities. Oh, what about Justin? Tell us about Justin. You know, what do you think of your brother? And, he's very gracious about it. But if I were in his shoes, I'd definitely get tired answering all those questions. So Patrick Herbert is a guy that I think they will definitely try to get more involved, especially if defense is keying on Terrence Ferguson. So you have Patrick Herbert, and then you also have to talk about some of these transfers. You have Casey Kelly, who transfers in from Ole Miss, and then you also have Caden Ludwig, who comes over from Colorado. So I think that those are some of the more experienced guys that they have at the position. Casey Kelly doesn't seem like he's too much of a threat in the passing game, and then Caden Ludwig, I think, was actually a linebacker during his time at Colorado. Caden Ludwig. So now he comes back to his home state. Happy Valley, Oregon is his hometown, and he was a linebacker coming out of high school, but obviously there's some experience there, or at the very least some potential for him to have an impact at tight end. So definitely an interesting development there. So you have some more bodies at least at the tight end spot. I think that's why Oregon can enter the 23 season with some confidence, just seeing that you have some more bodies to work with in fall camp. You more or less get a month to work those guys in, with Casey Kelly and Caden Ludwig not participating in spring ball because they weren't here yet. I think that Casey Kelly actually announced his commitment after the spring game during his visit. And then you also have Kenyon Sadiq, who we definitely have to talk about, the number one recruit in the state of Idaho in 2023. He seems like he was a guy who is generating some buzz out there in Eugene after a strong spring. Definitely arrived and enrolled at Oregon as a little bit undersized, 6'2", 6'3", in that 220 range, 215 range. So you got to put some weight on that frame if you're Kenyon Sadiq, to make sure that you can not only affect the game as a pass catcher and a playmaker, which he certainly had the ability to do for Skyline High School as a senior. He was just doing great stuff in his tape, being a guy who could hurt the defenses over the top and really just kind of be that spark plug of the offense. So I think he definitely comes into Oregon with something to prove and may end up carving out a bigger role than a lot of people expected, because like we said earlier on in the show, Oregon was kind of pressed for bodies when it came to spring football. So now I think you're looking a little bit better from that depth perspective in that tight end room, but you're still trying to kind of figure out, where's my production going to come from if I'm Drew Maringer, if I'm Will Stein at the tight end position, aside from Terrence Ferguson. You know what Terrence Ferguson is, and I think you kind of even know what Patrick Herbert is. He just needs more opportunities. He's a guy who needs more touches. I want to see him get more involved in the passing game for Oregon. And then I think we just kind of remains to be seen what these guys from the portal can do in Casey Kelly and Caden Ludwig. And then you also can't count out Kenyon Sadiq. So we'll see. Kenyon Sadiq is probably one of those guys that I think could be most likely to burn a red shirt as a true freshman from this 23 class, just because they need some of that depth and some of that production at the tight end spot. And I think you ultimately want to find yourself in a spot where you have more than two tight ends that you can turn to at any given time. Look at last year. You had Terrence Ferguson. You were comfortable with him. You had Maliki Montevau. You were comfortable with him. You had Cam McCormick, who's now at Miami. You were comfortable with him, and Patrick Herbert. So I think things were definitely really in Oregon's favor from a numbers standpoint last year. Now we're kind of back to that point, but there's still a lot of question marks. We just don't know, haven't really seen what a lot of those guys are ultimately able to do. Christopher is in the chat, and he says he thinks Herbie will take a huge step this year. I definitely agree with that one. I think obviously taking care of his health and the best availability, the best ability being availability, is certainly on the table. I think with a guy like Patrick Herbert, who just hasn't been able to catch a break with the injury bug until last year. So I think that he is definitely one of the guys that I am most excited about in the Oregon offense this year, because he's not really talked about a whole lot. And Terrence Ferguson is a super talented guy. Would not be surprised if he is in the NFL draft conversation for the 2024 draft. But Drew Maringer's got to be excited, because if I'm him, I'm looking at this season and saying, hey, it's not just Terrence Ferguson. Look at what Patrick Herbert can do. Look at what Kenyon Sadiq can do. And then let me show you what I can do with some of these transfers in Casey Kelly and Caden Ludwig. So that's kind of what I have to say about the tight end spot. There's one more position that we need to talk about, and that is the wide receivers. Oregon's wide receiver room is crazy deep. Crazy deep. If you just look at the names that you have on the roster at the position. You have Troy Franklin, who is an absolute stud. I think he obviously is the talk of that room. And just to get back real quick to the checklist lens that we're kind of looking at this episode from. Sorry, I got a little bit excited and ahead of myself. You have to figure out how to get all of these receivers involved. It's not like you have to have a super concrete answer by the end of fall camp, but you got to be rotating these guys in and just seeing who does this better than this guy, why? How does this guy really make his mark? What's the best part of his game? Because you have so many big names and so many talented guys, a lot of experience, that it's going to be hard to get all these guys the ball. You have Troy Franklin, like I already mentioned, and then you have Trayshawn Holden, who comes over from Alabama, and you have Tez Johnson, who comes over from Troy, and Gary Bryant Jr., who comes over from USC. Tez Johnson made a decent amount of noise in the spring game with that really long catch and run touchdown. And then Gary Bryant Jr. Is one of those later arrivals, if you will. I think that we're definitely going to see Gary Bryant Jr. and maybe even Tez Johnson be some guys that could make an impact in the return game and the kick return game. And I think that's kind of an area you could see Oregon really leveraging their depth at the wide receiver spot. There's going to be guys that not everybody can touch the ball, right? That's kind of the problem that we're trying to break down here. But, who are those team first guys that you don't see start as a wide receiver, but maybe they're going to make an impact as a returner? You have Micah Williams. I don't know how to say his name. I thought it was Micah Williams, but then I heard people saying Mackay, the world-class sprinter that joined the team as a walk-on. He's probably going to be doing some stuff as a returner versus more of that traditional wide receiver role. So you have some of those guys that I mentioned, and then you have Chris Hudson, who comes back in the slot. He's probably going to be battling with Tez Johnson. And then you also have Kyler Casper, who I called on the podcast yesterday a sleeping giant in that wide receiver room. 6'6", 207 pounds, got a full year of college football under his belt, got a redshirt under his belt. He's ready to go. And I think he just offers something different to this Oregon offense. And he's ready to show in 2023 why he was such a big name wide receiver, why he was an All-American in that 2022 class. And then we haven't even talked about Jurion Dickey. Jurion Dickey is someone I am crazy excited about at the wide receiver position, and definitely someone in this 2023 recruiting class, this true freshman class, that I think is very likely to see quite a bit of playing time this year. He did get injured his senior year, and that cut his senior season short. I believe he only played 4 games. So once I saw that he got injured, it kind of made me, pump the brakes a little bit as far as, is this guy going to see the field a whole lot? And we saw that one-handed catch highlight from practice that was going around on social media. A lot of people got excited about that. It really feels like he hasn't lost a step. He's a guy who tackled his recovery head on, and he's ready to make an impact for Junior Adams in that wide receiver room. So how does his skill set maybe compare to Trayshawn Holden as, some of those bigger body wide receivers for Oregon? Obviously, Holden has the experience edge there, but Dickey is a really physical guy and someone who can do quite a bit after the catch. Maybe you have a couple of better route runners in that room, but he is a guy who definitely wants to make an impact. You also have Ashton Kozart, who was an Under Armour All-American in his own right, that signed with the Ducks. Coming out of the state of Texas, he's battle tested. He's originally a Pacific Northwest guy, so kind of a homecoming of sorts for him, and that definitely means a lot. And then Justice Lowe, you can't forget about Justice Lowe. I still might be forgetting about a couple of receivers, but I think I hit on just about everybody. Justice Lowe is another guy that is entering his second year at Oregon after signing with the Ducks out of Lake Oswego, I think it was. Former Utah commit, he's flashed a little bit. I remember he made some plays in his first spring when we were out there, but he kind of flew under the radar. So you have all of these guys that are ready to make an impact for Oregon. How are you going to get all of these guys touches? This could be one of the most loaded wide receiver rooms that we've seen at Oregon. And keep in mind, they lost quite a few guys just at the end of last season. No more Chase Cota. No more Dante Thornton. He's at Tennessee. I think he's going to have a monster year. No more Isaiah Brevard. no more Seven McGee. All those guys hit the portal or are no longer with Oregon. So that speaks to the job that Junior Adams and the rest of this coaching staff have done, kind of reloading and retooling this position. I didn't think they were going to take 3 wide receivers. I talked about Gary Bryant Jr. being a late addition and kind of being a luxury guy at the spot, because Trayshawn Holden and Tez Johnson were able to get there early and have full springs. But Gary Bryant Jr. comes in kind of being a crafty, twitchy wide receiver, 5'11" or so from the Southern California area. He was at USC for 3 years, I think. Yeah, 3 years, and he still has quite a bit of eligibility. So I think he's kind of a wild card in this wide receiver room, and maybe he's going to try to make a name for himself, and he wants to have a hat at the table when it comes to that battle for the slot. Maybe it's not Chris Hudson. Maybe it's not Tez Johnson. Maybe it's Gary Bryant Jr. So that's kind of where we're at, I think, with Oregon's offense heading into the 2023 season. Who's to say what kind of updates we'll get between now and the season opener? I think they're at a good spot in terms of health. I think Junior Angalau, who missed a majority, if not all of spring, the Texas offensive line transfer, looks like he is on track for a healthy recovery. He may already be a full practice participant. I'm not quite sure, but I think he's someone that should definitely be in the mix for some significant snaps on that offensive line for Alik, Terry, and the Ducks. But that's kind of the first part of the checklist that we have on today's podcast for Oregon. Oregon's offense, that is. And man, some big shoes to fill with Kenny Dillingham's departure to Arizona State. But you got Will Stein, who comes in with a whole lot of promise. You got your quarterback back from a year ago, and Bo Nix. Cannot overemphasize the importance of continuity at that position. And then you have a loaded backfield, loaded wide receiver room, and a tight end room that I think is going to be hungry to prove some people wrong and show that it's not just the Terrence Ferguson show. That's just my little summary there. That's what we're looking at for Oregon's offensive checklist here in fall camp. Moving right along, we are in part 2 of the podcast now. We're going to be looking at Oregon's defensive checklist. But before we do that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these comments, some of these questions. Keep those rolling for you guys that are here in the live chat. Cash Out Win comments, I think Oregon needs to focus on physicality. I know they already said it, but they have to mean it. Yeah, that the physicality is one of those points that always gets brought up in the spring, always gets brought up in fall camp. Talk about it all you want. Talk is cheap. I want to see some really physical play come in that home opener against Portland State. And that's kind of what these guys are talking about, right? You need to be banging in practice and, bring that physicality and have that mean edge that the great Oregon defenses in the past have had. I think that this Oregon defense, if I'm this Oregon defense, I think that the floor should be the 2019 defense and the ceiling should be whatever they want it to be. This is an unbelievably talented defense at Oregon. You're working with some star coaches in Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi. I think that the standard has been set for what this defense can do. And I think part of the reason I think that the Oregon defense can be even better than 2019 is because of the transfer portal and how that's going to kind of mesh with the 2023 recruiting class and getting all those guys on campus. So I think that the physicality, talk is cheap. Let me see it on the field. So I could not agree with this point more. Obi-Wan, he had some questions yesterday, so thanks for coming back. Always love seeing people come back to the show. Question is, did Bo getting injured show the lack of faith in Ty to continue by the rest of the team? I don't know. This one's tough. I mean, I think I was kind of thinking about a lack of faith in Ty Thompson when I was watching that game last year, just because of the situation that they were in. The fact that he didn't get to attempt a pass, I think, was very telling of where last year's staff kind of placed the ceiling or the limit on his game. And granted, this was such a tough decision, such a tough situation, rather, for Ty Thompson to come in at after Bo Nix gets hurt. Rivalry game against Washington, the atmosphere was insane. I don't necessarily think it shows a lack of faith in Ty. Certainly not by the rest of the team. I mean, I think all the other players certainly support Ty. It's just a matter of the offensive staff, I think, feeling confident enough in his abilities and his composure and his poise and his knowledge of the offense to look at that situation, realize what it is, bows down, but that shouldn't change a whole lot, at least on the basic level of what you're able to execute with your offense. So that's why I think I'm really interested to see what Ty is going to be able to do this year. Hopefully, Oregon can get into some blowout games and Ty can get some good reps, and you can really see that he's taken the offseason to improve his game and just become that next level quarterback that the Ducks need. Let's see. Brooks says, we need to land someone. Just saw Colin Simmons commit to Texas, 5-star edge rusher. Brooks says, we need to land someone like him. Now it's possible with the Big Ten. No excuses. Can't say we are in a quote-unquote weak conference. Yeah. You don't need a 5-star in this class necessarily. I think sometimes people get too hyped up on the rankings, but you need a difference maker along the defensive line, a difference maker on the edge. And right now, I feel like the best option for Oregon is Aiden Breland, 5-star defensive lineman out of Santa Ana Mater Dei. Talked about him a little bit last year, but you definitely need to land someone who has the ability to be a game-changing talent along the defensive line. Certainly not an area that Oregon has made a ton of noise at recently recruiting, unless you're looking at the transfer portal, right? Or I should say, maybe more specifically in the 2024 class. You had Mateo Uiagalelei in the 2023 class. Huge recruiting win along the line of scrimmage, along the defensive line for Dan Lanning and Tosh Lapointe over the likes of Ohio State and USC. You also go into the portal to get Jordan Birch from South Carolina. Really high expectations for him. He's kind of, I think, really positioned himself to be one of the focal points of this defense. But when it comes to the 2024 class, I think you're absolutely right, Brooks. You need to get somebody kind of on that tier of Colin Simmons. Elijah Rushing didn't work out going to Arizona. But now I think that Aiden Breland is looking like the absolute priority along the defensive line for Oregon. Definitely has that nasty, mean edge to his game. You also have Jericho Johnson, a defensive lineman that has Oregon in his final schools, along with Washington, Utah, and USC. He's out of the Northern California area, so I think that he is definitely another priority. But Breland is definitely that guy along the defensive line that I think Oregon is really going to hone in and focus on here. All right, last question we got here. We'll get 2 more questions, and then we'll get into defense. Christopher says, what about Casper lining up as a receiving tight end to get snaps with that deep wide receiver room? Yeah, I think we've talked about this a little bit in the spring. I mean, I don't think Kyler Casper is a tight end. So I think that all the development and time he's put into the position, you want to try to get him involved as a tight end. I think that he only does that if you really aren't confident in the tight end room and that depth. It is a deep wide receiver room, and I want to see Casper get on the field, but I think if he gets on the field, it's going to be as a wide receiver. Andrew says, there's no way Dickey or Dowdell get redshirted, right? I don't know. This one's tough. I think both of those guys definitely have paths to see the field, but they're in really, really crowded positions. Dowdell was an early enrollee. Dickey wasn't. We'll see if that has any kind of impact on those guys being able to see the field. Dan Lanning's talked a lot about the value of enrolling early. I think right now I would say that I think Dowdell is more likely to get redshirted just because you have Bucky, Noah, and then Jordan James. If he doesn't redshirt, I think it kind of means that he's maybe outperforming Jordan James. That's kind of just me hypothetically looking down the line for this situation to happen. And then as for Dickey, he's going to have to make a name for himself probably against Trayshawn Holden, right? Seeing that he's the bigger body receiver that they're probably projecting to play quite a big role this year. So keep those questions coming. I'll see what I can get. And then we will get now into the defensive checklist. I think there's a couple of things, right? We talked about physicality, making the defense one that people fear. That's been kind of a talking point so far in fall camp. And I think that Oregon is more than capable of being that defense that people fear. A lot of that starts with physicality. A lot of that starts with discipline. not being a defense that's committing penalties and creating good situations for the offense. I think that's something that Oregon's really struggled with in the past, not necessarily last year, but just not making it worse for yourself and not making it easier for opposing offenses. I think third down defense is going to be huge. So you got to work situationally in fall camp, hopefully on some big third down situations, some third and longs. There were just way too many instances when a play would break down and the Ducks would end up surrendering a long third down gain. You can't have that if you want to be taking the next step as a defense. So those are kind of some of the big picture things. I think one of them I'm going to start with that's probably at the priority at the very top of the list for a lot of Oregon fans is the pass rush. You got to figure out the pass rush in fall camp because you're running out of time to figure it out ahead of the 2023 season. And there are some dudes that Oregon can rely on in this pass rush. You lose DJ Johnson from a year ago, and he's now in the NFL working for the playing for the Panthers. But Jordan Burch comes in and he's the talk of the pass rush almost instantly, right? 6'6", 275 pounds is kind of what he was listed at last year. We don't have any updated height and weights as of right now for this Oregon football team, but Jordan Burch is that guy that Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi are really hoping can take that defensive line to the next level and do it by getting after the quarterback. That's definitely an area Oregon fell short in last year. But you also have Mace Funa on the other side of Jordan Burch, possibly. He's the most experienced outside linebacker edge guy that they have on this roster. But we could also be seeing guys like Mateo Uiagalelei making an impact from an early point in this season and in their college careers. And I think something that you have to think about with Mateo, he played for a national powerhouse program. The St. John Bosco Braves were national champions last year. Definitely have some really, really good coaching that he brings to the table. Burch talking about Mateo and fall camp at the media day, talking about how he's doing moves that other guys can't do. And Mateo is probably, 6'5", around 260, 265 himself. So Mateo Uiagalelei is a guy that just moves differently. And I think that even though Kayvon Thibodeau didn't really see that much of the field his true freshman year, he didn't really carve out a starting role until later in the season. I think that there's a chance that Mateo is just on a different level. And, Kayvon is a first-round draft pick. He's in the NFL. He was a number 1 overall recruit, but they took different paths to Oregon. And I think that I'm excited about Mateo because I want to see what he can do for this Oregon defense to kind of back up what I've said about him, right? I've talked about how Mateo Uiagalelei is the guy that you bring Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi to Oregon to land, to win recruiting battles against Larry Johnson and Ohio State, which has been a factory for edge rushers, to win recruiting battles against Lincoln Riley and Sean Nua over there at USC, the hometown school that he had been so closely linked to for so long. So maybe we end up seeing Jordan Burch on one side, Mateo Uiagalelei on the other side, or it's Jordan Burch and Mace Funa. But if we're talking about the pass rush, I think Brandon Dorlus certainly deserves a seat at the table. He's certainly going to be a focal point of that pass rush for Oregon because he is one of the most athletic defensive linemen that the Ducks have, one of the best defensive linemen in the entire Pac-12, and he's also incredibly versatile. I think that's when Brandon Dorlus is at his best, when he's kind of moving around and giving you a headache as an offensive lineman. And another thing to think about with this pass rush is how strong Oregon is in the interior. You get Popo Amavai back, an all Pac-12 caliber guy who missed all of last year with an injury. He's going to come back with a purpose and just kind of that mean, nasty edge to his game that he wants to be like, hey, I'm back. This is my defensive line. He was the face of that Oregon defensive line, I feel like, or at least one of those main contributors before he got banged up. And then you also have Casey Rogers, who has just been an absolute gem out of the transfer portal, following Tony Tuioti from Lincoln to Eugene after playing with him at Nebraska. He is one of the most undervalued pieces of that defensive line, in my opinion, because he's not stuff in the stat sheet. He's kind of taken those big offensive linemen on, those double teams on, and freeing up spots for, guys that are stemming behind and around him, and for those linebackers to come flying up the middle. And when we're talking about the pass rush, obviously the linebackers are going to play a role in that too. We're going to have to see how well Justin Jacobs can get after the passer. I think he does a lot of different things well, but in his game, I think that his athleticism and his coverage ability for his size are really kind of where he made his money as one of the more transfer portal, one of the big targets at linebacker, one of the top linebackers in the transfer portal coming over from Iowa. So the pass rush is obviously a massive priority for Oregon. That's probably the biggest thing they have to figure out from this past year. You have way too much talent. I'm saying it now on August 10th, and I think everybody listening to this or watching this will agree. You have way too much talent on this defense to not have a good pass rush, which is why I think that's an area they need to grow, and that has to probably be the top priority heading into 2023 for this defense. All right, if you guys are just joining us on the live stream, thank you so much for stopping by, whether you're on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. Just excited to have you guys along and appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk some Ducks with me, a little bit of recruiting talk here and there. But just wanted to take this time to ask you guys a quick favor. Hit that thumbs up button for me, the like button. It only takes a second out of your day. And hit that subscribe button for me to show some support for the channel. Really been loving the growth that we've been seeing lately on the channel. I love doing this, love interacting with you guys and covering Duck football and, of course, Duck recruiting. All right, moving on in our checklist. We're kind of hitting all different levels, right? The checklist for Oregon football and their defense continues. You need to find somebody that can replace Christian Gonzalez at cornerback. And when I say replace, I don't mean someone who can be Christian Gonzalez at cornerback, because that's not really that realistic. Christian Gonzalez was a different breed. First round draft pick at corner. I don't know if you have that caliber of talent on the roster right now. A guy that you can point to and say, he's going to the NFL for sure. He's a difference maker. He's kind of on Gonzo's level. Gonzo had the length, he had the speed, he had the ball skills, he had the technique, fluid hips, quick feet. You name it, he had it. I don't know if Oregon has a guy that can be Christian Gonzalez. But what they do need is an alpha to really emerge at that position. I think you need a corner that you can go to him. Demetrius Martin says, hey, I need you to go lock down this side of the field, or I need to be able to come to you every week and be confident that you can lock down the team's opposing number one wide receiver. And you have some good options, right? Nico Reed comes over from Colorado out of the portal. He has familiarity with Demetrius Martin from his days at Colorado. And then you also have Kyrie Jackson, who comes over from Alabama as a taller guy, around 6'3" versus Nico Reed's 5'10", 5'11". And then you also have some guys that are already on the roster. I think you have Dante Manning and Triquez Bridges coming back. And we already know kind of what those guys are, especially when it comes to Bridges, who has been, a consistent guy, but maybe not a huge difference maker that I think Oregon has needed. But we always talk about it, safety or corner, and it looks like he has some clarity as far as the cornerback position goes this coming year. But I think this is a question that we can hit on here from Jacob. Do you think Dante Manning will have a bounce back year? I think Dante Manning has been showing steady signs of growth since last season. Keep in mind, he's the highest rated recruit at corner that Oregon has ever signed. So I think that he was a twitchy guy, quick guy, athletic guy. He had so much promise coming out of high school. Then he kind of got banged up. Then you had the coaching transition. So I feel like the dominoes haven't really been falling in his favor lately, but I do think that he could have a bounce back year. I think that he just has so much untapped potential still in his game. He's a guy that if he goes out and has a couple of good games or gets a couple interceptions, makes some big plays, I think that could be the difference between him taking that next step. He just needs to show it a little bit more. And I think you just need to build that confidence that he can be that guy for you as Oregon looks like they're looking to kind of figure some stuff out in that secondary, in that cornerback room. And then Andrew has a good point too, saying that Florence is like the Connerly of the defense. high floor and super high ceiling. Because I was going to mention Jaleel Florence. I think Jaleel Florence is a guy that can definitely take the next step in his development. He enrolled early as a member of Oregon's 2022 recruiting class, and I think he showed some flashes during his true freshman season to really give you some confidence. He's a longer defensive back that can also run, and then just the ball skills that he has, I think also can contribute to what he's able to do as a playmaker. Coming out of Lincoln High School in San Diego, that's a pipeline that the Ducks have established for a while now. I was just at Lincoln this past weekend to see Achilles Smith Jr., Oregon's 2025 quarterback, commit. So I definitely would agree with this comment that Florence can be that guy. It looks like Zahim is also in agreement, saying that Jaleel Florence can be someone for Oregon. So we just talked about all those guys. It would make you think that Oregon's cornerback room is in pretty good hands, which I agree with, right? But we haven't even talked about the freshmen. And I think you absolutely have to talk about the freshmen because Oregon signed 5 corners from the high school ranks in 2023. I think the one guy that we have to talk about is Cole Martin, Demetrius Martin's son, All-American caliber guy out of Basha High School in Chandler, Arizona, originally from the Southern California area, which we know is Demetrius Martin's old stomping grounds as a Pasadena native, I want to say. Cole Martin is exciting, man. I'm super excited about what Cole Martin can do. I think that there's honestly some similarity with Roderick Pleasant, who was an Under Armour All-American corner that the Ducks signed, and he's been making all the headlines for his speed. But I feel like these guys are kind of similar, right? They're both a little bit on the smaller side. I'd probably say 5'9", maybe 5'10" on a really good day, but both of these guys are smaller defensive backs. They're super twitchy, super quick, really explosive, tons of playmaking ability. They both returned. They were both returners for their respective high school teams. And I think that Cole Martin comes to Oregon with a chip on his shoulder to prove, I'm not just a coach's son. I can ball. And I think that's part of the reason that he should be able to do something, because he is a coach's son. And those guys, they just look at the game a little bit differently. And I think they're a little bit further ahead when it comes to development than a lot of their peers. So Cole Martin had a really good spring game, and I think I'm super excited to see what he can do. We'll see if that's as a corner or maybe as a returner. But I think Oregon has options at corner, and that's all you can really ask for if you're Demetrius Martin trying to figure out what this room looks like after Christian Gonzalez heads to the NFL. So Cole Martin is someone I'm really excited about. Roderick Pleasant is another guy that I'm really excited about. So yeah, I mean, Zahim is hitting it on the head here. For a smaller back, Cole Martin plays physical, love his game. Yeah, he actually couldn't play in the Adidas All-American game because he messed up his shoulder just with some big hits for Chandler en route to a state title. So that's a guy who is more than willing to put his body on the line, even as an undersized defensive back. Super tough, super nasty. Love everything about Cole Martin. With Roderick Pleasant, I think that's an interesting one because after he committed to Oregon, all the headlines were him, choosing Oregon over SC. They were his skills on the track field and how naturally gifted he was. But some of the talking points that I heard being out here in Southern California, where Roderick Pleasant is from, is this a football guy that can run and really is gifted on the track field, or is this a track guy who is just a freak athlete? Is this a track guy who also happens to be able to play football? And talking to people on the Southern California scene, some people who know Roderick Pleasant pretty well, some of the returns that I got is that his true passion really does lie in football. He's going to run track at Oregon. Obviously, that was a big part of why they were able to win out in that recruitment. But Roderick Pleasant, just for him to finally be able to put the recruiting process behind him, I think that he has all the potential in the world to really develop into a really talented defensive back for Oregon. I was at his commitment ceremony at Sarah in Gardena back in February, and you could tell it was a super, super heavy moment for him. All the pressures of going to SC. His brother went to SC. He is a Southern California native, but he took the leap. He took the jump and said, I'm not going to go to SC and just follow in that pipeline from Sarah. I'm going to be different. I'm going to head to Eugene. I'm going to play for Demetrius Martin, who is one of the best developers of the cornerback position in the country. So I'm super excited to see what he can do. I think Roderick Pleasant probably has a quicker track to the plane and to snaps as a returner. Think about all the options Oregon has in the return game. You have Gary Bryant, you have Roderick Pleasant, you have Mekhi Williams, you have Tez Johnson, Chris Hudson. There are a lot of guys that can make an impact on the special teams as well. And Roderick Pleasant is someone that I'm excited about. Rounding out that cornerback room, you have Solomon Davis, who was a late flip from Arizona out of Charter Oaks in Covina, California, another Southern California guy. And when I went to talk to his coach, just so many good things to be said about Solomon, just a guy that elevates the play of everybody around him. Super, super high character guy, great kid, definitely made of the right stuff. So even if he doesn't play this year, I think he's somebody that only leaves a positive impact on that cornerback room and is going to thrive in the competition. Then you have Colin Gill from Washington, D.C., St. John's. And he's a little bit of a project from what I've been told at the cornerback spot, but he comes from a powerhouse program. Really, really versatile guy. So maybe he's someone that we don't see just playing cornerback at Oregon. Maybe he floats around in the secondary, plays some safety, plays some nickel. We'll have to see. But even though cornerback is kind of a question mark for Oregon, not in terms of they're a question mark because you don't know who's going to play or you don't know, like it's a bad position. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm looking at this as a question mark because they have so many options. And I think that Nico Reed probably has the fast track to some playing time because of his familiarity with Demetrius Martin, even though he was a late commitment in this transfer portal haul. And then Kyrie Jackson obviously has seen what it's like at Alabama, knows what it takes to win, knows what it takes to be an elite competitor. He's a guy that's probably going to play quite a bit as well. You just don't see guys come in from the transfer portal to sit on the bench. More likely than not, they don't commit to a school. In this case, they don't commit to Oregon unless they expect to be a pretty decent part, a pretty significant part of what's going on in the 2023 season. So a lot of options at cornerback for Oregon, plenty of reason to think that they should field a very good unit, even if it means potentially moving on from some of those guys who have been around for a while in favor of some of these new faces. That's kind of where I'm going to leave it. Let's also talk about the safety position. We got two more spots to talk about in the checklist. I think Oregon needs to get some clarity at safety. Oregon's had a lot of guys that have just been kind of okay at safety, not difference makers. Nobody that, wholeheartedly deserves to be on the field more than someone else. I don't think safety is a strength of this team right now. But again, look at the guys that they brought in. You brought in Cody DeCambra from Bishop Gorman, who was a pretty talented safety. Why am I blanking on who else Oregon brought in at safety? Hold on here. Let me look this up. At safety, Tyler Turner. Tyler Turner is the other guy he brought in at safety from Texas. But looking at the guys from the portal, Evan Williams, Bennett Williams' brother out of Fresno State, there's been a lot of praise heaped on him during the time, between the time of his arrival and coming to Oregon. I think he's someone that just knows the game really well, has a good football IQ, feel for the game, has played a lot, has some experience even just going against Oregon, right? From this Oregon Fresno State game in 2021. I think he's a guy who's going to play a lot. Tysheem Johnson is someone that I'm super interested and excited to see what he's going to be able to do. He comes over from Ole Miss, and his versatility was just being touted so much throughout all of spring. So I think that Oregon's in a good spot with Tysheem Johnson and Evan Williams. Are those guys gonna carve out starting roles? I wouldn't be surprised. You have Steve Stevens the fourth, who comes back to Oregon. He's been at Oregon for a super long time, but just really hasn't separated himself from the pack. He came to Oregon with Javon Holland, so he definitely knows what he's doing at this point, and now it's just about going out and executing and producing and really leading this group. And then you also have Brian Addison, who's a 6'5" safety and was arguably the most competitive, the most productive, maybe the best safety for Oregon last year. Maybe that's a stretch, but I think I was really excited with what he was able to do for that Oregon defense in 2022. And I think he's probably going to be somewhat involved in this defense in 2023. I would be surprised if he wasn't involved. Andrew says here, I miss the general so much. He was the ultimate eraser. Washington would never have scored like they did on him. Talking about Verone McKinley, who I believe is playing with Javon Holland on the Miami Dolphins now. But yeah, I think Verone McKinley was definitely just made of the right stuff. Literally the general of that defense. Guys were drawn to him. Guys were fired up by him. So now maybe we see if Evan Williams or Tysheem Johnson can be that one of those guys. All right, let's kind of start to wind things down just past the hour mark with the linebacker core. The linebacker core is one of the most fascinating groups on this defense for me because heading into the offseason, once you lost Noah Sewell, once you lost Jackson LeDuc, Keith Brown, Justin Flo hit the portal and ended up at Arizona, you kind of look at it and you're like, oh, not really a lot. And then Harrison Taggart left, not really a lot of pieces to work with, but they moved some things around, right? You have Jeff Bossa, who comes back. He came to Oregon as a safety, but now really looks like a linebacker. I saw a video of that guy in practice, and he's wearing number 2 this year, and I had to take a second and kind of rub off my glasses. Not that I wear glasses, but be like, wow, that's not DJ Johnson. That's Jeff Bossa. That dude looks huge. Jeff Bossa looks absolutely transformed from a year ago, and it could come at a better time because I feel like there were a lot of instances last year where I saw Jeff Bossa just getting run over. So now he looks like he spent that time in the weight room and is going to be able to physically keep up with the demands of the position and obviously have a good feel. I think Dan Lanning was really excited about Jeff Bossa after he got hired, just talking about how he kind of has the speed and athleticism to take this linebacker room, take his play to where the game of college football is kind of going, just super athletic, fast, physical linebackers. He's going to be, I think, the guy that can really cover, hopefully, for Oregon in 2023. And then you also have Justin Jacobs, who comes over from Iowa, returning from an injury. Still kind of have to see how he plays. Looked good in the spring game, but it looks like you're probably going to have Jeff Bossa and Justin Jacobs as your projected starters. And then you have Jamal Hill, who comes down from the secondary, comes down from the safety spot, and has also bulked up. The returns from what I'm hearing about Jamal Hill have been very positive as far as just him being a guy who looks like he might even be more comfortable at linebacker than he did at safety. He certainly had the physicality to play that position even as a safety. So now he's at linebacker, and it looks like he's feeling really good there. And then Devin Jackson. Devin Jackson is a guy that I think we might have forgotten about a little bit in the linebacker room for Oregon. He's bulked up to 228 pounds. He said that he got to Oregon at 207, and he's at 228 now. So he's a guy who definitely made a name for himself kind of flying around on defense. His speed and athleticism were two of the biggest traits to his game coming out of high school. He came out of Nebraska and was an All-American. So the whole conversation with Devin Jackson was bulking up, but not losing the speed. Bulking up, but not losing that athleticism. And I think that is, as of right now, it looks like a box that he's checked. I haven't been able to see him because, I'm not in Eugene, obviously, but I think that he could be a guy that ends up carving out a role for the linebackers at Oregon as well. And then we have to talk about Connor Sowell, who comes over from Arizona State, a former safety, I want to say in high school, but kind of a guy that flew under the radar. Definitely just kind of has that blue-collar work ethic. I think he's pretty smart, so he should be able to help this defense and this linebacker group stay on the same page. So it's really, I think, Jeff Bossa and Justin Jacobs at the top. But then I wouldn't be surprised to see Jamal Hill and Connor Sowell also involved. And then you have Devin Jackson and then true freshman Jerry Mixon. Basically, my biggest takeaway on the linebacker group is I've really gotten a whole lot more confident that this group can really be serviceable and maybe even more than serviceable for Oregon in 2023. I think that Noah Sewell was a good player, but wasn't necessarily as great as a lot of people expected him to be at Oregon. And I think that he was the 5-star linebacker and, he was Panay's brother. I think that there were maybe some expectations that were never realistic for Noah Sewell, who's now with the Bears in the NFL. So the linebacker core is a group that I'm feeling good about, and I think should definitely be one to keep an eye on for Oregon here in 2023. And I'm going to be excited to go back and look at the spring game highlights a little bit and see these guys playing separately, but then kind of remind myself they're all going to be playing on the same team, on the same side of the ball when the season kicks off come September. All right. I think that'll do it for me here on today's episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. You guys know how it goes. Do me a favor, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'm on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Important to lock in with me on social media as well. I'm at mtorres sports on Twitter and Instagram. And then I'm at mtorres sports on Facebook as well. And then make sure you check out all my written work over on ducksdigest.com and share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, with other Duck fans. Appreciate you guys taking some time out of your day to talk some Duck football with me. And until next time, you've been listening to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.